We're continuing our series called Seriously the Hard Sayings of Jesus. And what would catch your eye, if you were listening to the reading there, is this challenge. Let the dead bury their own dead. What is Jesus saying? Let the dead bury their own dead. This passage, I don't think, is really about how we interact with our families. Not in that way. This passage, I think, is more about that paradox. This is my kind of opening statement, opening gambit, that at the heart of the Christian faith, as part of the Christian journey, there is both, as part of the story, joy and suffering that come along with it. This is not just a story where everything goes swimmingly well from here on in, and it's not just a story where everything is terrible from here on in. Verse 51 framed that thinking in my mind. I don't know if that could be put up on the screen. Verse 51. As the time approached for him to be taken up to heaven, Jesus resolutely sets out for Jerusalem. Do you see those two things that are coming together? Jesus is on his way up to glory, up to heaven, but he can't get there but for going to the cross. The nearer he gets to heaven, the nearer he gets to the cross. And we are what? If we are believers, maybe that's something you're thinking about. If we are believers, we are following him. And our story is twinned with his. We share in his sufferings. The nearer we get to glory, the nearer we need to encounter the cross. There is this glorious story that is ours for the believer, that is open to everyone, and it's an amazing story. And at the same time, there's that, and then there's this narrow road with a cross in it. It's so important for us, if you're a Christian, or if you want to encounter Christianity and you want to think about it, it's so important for you to think about this. Because we think, or perhaps we get taught, in fact, we do get taught, I know that this is taught in the Christian world, that finding God means that everything will go well from now on in. There is that message out there, proclaimed really loud. Everything's going to, if you find God, that's it, your problems are over. There's this like prosperous message that's around. And yet, if you absorb that and if you take that in, if you hit a tough time down the line, and people hit tough times down the line, you start asking yourself the question, well, what is it that I have believed in? Faith can crumble really quickly if that's all that you believe. And at the same time, we think and we get taught that faith is just about sacrifice. Sometimes it's us telling us these things. We tell ourselves everything's going to be fine, everything's going to be great, we've found God, everything's going to be great, and we tell ourselves, oh, this story with Jesus is about how much I can be subdued and how much I can cave and how much I can wear. And if we do that, if that's the only story that we tell ourselves, we will kill our faith. And, critically, I think, we'll never get to know God. We'll never get to know him in the joys, and we'll never get to know him in the sufferings. Joy and suffering can come together. Now, this might be, you might be sort of absorbing this and saying, I'm not interested, I don't care. Or you might be saying to yourself, I don't know if I can process all that. I don't know if I really, really think that. I don't know if I really believe that about a God. I don't know if he'd do that. I don't know if it works like that. Think on the way that we love our loved ones. Think of what the relationship is like with those that we love. I've seen in the last 12 months, I know a few parents of tinies who love their babies with all of their heart. And at the same time, have lives that are soaked in sacrifice. Everything is sacrificed. Sleep is sacrificed. Social life is sacrificed. Sometimes it feels, I think, like sanity is sacrificed. And at the same time, I know older offspring who do the same for their elderly parents. Sacrifice through love. And at the end of that would say, and this is a thing I've heard over and over again, I wouldn't have it any other way. Wouldn't change a thing about it. Why? In those moments, love is deepened, crystallized, realized. the joyous Christian life that's on offer, that I declare to be a joyous life, doesn't rule out suffering. Doesn't mean that everything's going to go grand. And it does say that could well be for you a defining point. So the sermon today is it's about two things. How joy and suffering and cost make for the best Christian life. How those two things coming together can still be what we call good news. Why that's still great. Why you don't need to look for another story. So we see it in two ways in the text. We see it with what we know, we see it with how we think, we see it with our mindset, and we see it with where we go. We see it with what we know. See what I've done there? I've done a rhyming thing. It's like a preaching thing from the 90s, something like that. It's what we know. I was quite pleased with myself, actually, in the bath when I came up with that. It's a good little thing, that, Ash. A bit cheesy, but you'll remember it when you drive home. Where we know... No, you won't remember it. I got it wrong. What we know and where we go. What you think about in your mind, your thoughts, how they form, and your mission in life. So first one, what we know, verse 51 through to 56. Text comes in two parts, really. As the time approached for him to be taken up to heaven, Jesus resolutely set out for Jerusalem, and he sent messengers on ahead who went into a Samaritan village to get things ready for him. But the people there did not welcome him because he was heading for Jerusalem. When the disciples, James and John, saw this, they asked, Lord, this is brilliant, just let this resonate for a second. Do you want us to call down fire from heaven to destroy them? But Jesus rebuked them. Then he and his disciples went on to another village. Verse 53 there, particularly verse 53. It's the most polite description of xenophobia and hate speech I think you're ever likely to hear in your entire life. The people there did not welcome him because he was heading for Jerusalem. He was a Jew, and these were Samaritans. There's a great little series on Netflix at the moment called The Chosen. I don't know if you've seen The Chosen, but it dramatizes this moment really well. When we say they did not welcome him, that is not how the Jews and the Samaritans interacted. They would have been spitting. There would have been stones thrown. There would have been awful, like football fan style abuse. It would have been pretty awful. It would have been a real injustice. The disciples, James and John, would have felt this really near to them because of why Jesus was going there. Jesus was going there to bring peace. You'll have heard the story of the Good Samaritan. Jesus was going there with good news. He was going there with open arms. He was going there with forgiveness. And they get met with this volley of abuse. Stones thrown. Long bits of spit thrown at them. Just horribleness they would have met with. And then verse 54. And I think what's the most brilliant about this verse 54 is that they're not kidding. This is not a joke. They're not having a laugh. They're outraged. They've seen the God of miracles. They've heard the stories of the Old Testament about what God can do, and they are raging mad with this injustice that they've just felt. And they've said to Jesus, do you know what we should do with this? Do you know how to resolve this injustice? Do you know what the answer is here? I love it, and I wonder if you've ever wished it on somebody. Bet you have. I have. They wish down, or they pray down, fireballs on these Samaritans. God, do you know what we should do? Do you know what would resolve this crisis? These are never going to change, these people. These are horrible people. Let's rain down fireballs on them. That's the answer, God. That's the answer, Jesus. These two end up getting called the sons of thunder. I don't know when it happened, but I would imagine this might have formed Jesus' thinking when he called them the sons of thunder. A few things popped into my head as I thought about this incident. First thing was how quickly and how much injustice stirs us up. When we see an injustice as human beings, we can get really hacked off. When we watch the news, if you watch the news, whatever news source or wherever you get your news from, and you see some of the stuff that's going on in the world, you can get really angry, you can get really mad with that. Or even if you just see the news down the road and something terrible's happening. We also see how quick we are to think that we know exactly what right justice looks like. Don't know if you ever have that. Somebody cuts me up in the car, I'm thinking fireballs straight away. I am. And my kids will tell you I sometimes verbalize something like that out of my mouth. And what I'm thinking is, I know what justice looks like here. Do you ever feel like that? Do you ever feel like you just like, I know what's wrong here. I know what's right and wrong. Why can't everybody else see what's right and wrong? This is what needs to happen. Remember my mum used to shout at the television, chop his hand off on the news. Or other bits of him were often mentioned by my mother. And it was like, I know what justice needs to happen here. We get there really quickly, don't we? And the last thing that I recognize is how often with injustice, especially when it happens to us, how often that it's not really justice that we respond with. It's not really justice even that we want. We respond often with hate. I do. That's what it is. Story makes it clear, I think. Jesus, in verse 55, what does he do? Wise, patient Jesus rebukes them. We don't get to know what Jesus says. We don't get to know what the rebuke is. The little drama I'm watching on Netflix dramatizes it at the moment. The Chosen. It explains what they think Jesus says. And that maybe formed a little bit of my thinking. What we know from Jesus, I think, especially when we think about the story told about the Good Samaritan, what he knows about all of us in our hearts, the mess that sin has caused to everyone. Jesus says to these two disciples, James and John, I think he says two things. We've got no idea of their backstory. They've just been really horrible to us. We've got no idea of the last 100 years of what it's like to be a Samaritan. You don't have a clue what it's like to be like them. You've got no idea of the personal abuse that they've suffered at Jewish hands or foreigners' hands. You've got no idea of that. You've got no idea what's gone on in their day just this morning. We've got no idea of the backstory of other people. And choosing blitzkrieg, which is kind of what it is. It's kind of where the disciples went to. Jesus' disciples, been walking around with him for years. Go, I know what we should do, Jesus. Let's go with blitzkrieg tactics. Let's just blow them up. Let's end them. Jesus rebukes them and he says, that just makes you worse. That doesn't make you any better. These two disciples on that day lost a lot. They lost a lot up here, a lot of the way that they thought, a lot of the thinking patterns that they had developed were at cost. I think this is what Jesus does. This is what Jesus does if we believe in him. If we spend a day living in faith. If we listen to what he says. If we see him on the cross. If we believe in the story of the cross, which says everybody's sinned. Forgiveness is needed for everybody. We're all in a right mess. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. If we believe that, he starts to show us that everybody's got a backstory. If we believe in the cross, you've got to look at yourself. That's what he does with these two disciples. They look on other people for the first time, perhaps. There's been a whole flip of thinking in their minds. They've gone from self-righteousness, ego-fueled self-righteousness, and maybe a damning perspective on everybody else, to looking out at people for the first time with compassion. They've been properly humbled. What I would say to you in this moment is that kind of brain change. Think about the mindset that's out there. Think about your own head. To change things around like that is no small thing. Jesus is doing a miracle in our heads. He seeks to do a miracle in our heads. He wants to transform our minds. To be humble. To look out at people filled with compassion. To judge yourself first. To have that change around in your head is no small thing. It's a game changer, that kind of change. Think about Jesus on the cross. Persecuted. He looked out at those that were persecuting him with compassion. The people that put him on the cross, he didn't open his mouth before he was humbled. Sound like little things, and yet they changed the whole world around. God's got big ambitions for your thoughts. God's got big ambitions for your mind. He wants to turn around your way of thinking. That's the first thing that we see. God changes our thinking round. And it comes at a cost. Those disciples were bruised. That was a tough walk home, wherever they went after this. They had to let go some pretty deep-rooted thoughts. That's our challenge. Second thing that we see is that God speaks to where we go, our mission. What would you identify as your mission in life? What are you here for? Where are you headed? God speaks heavily, I believe, into our sense of what our mission on this earth is. If you had to think about it just for a second, what would you come up with? What is my mission? Where am I headed next? Where am I going? What is my 10-year plan? What is my 20-year plan? Jesus speaks dramatically into that. We see Jesus at the start of this story in verse 51. He's on a mission. We're Christians, and we are following a guy who is on a mission. He's going to heaven via the cross. Do you see that? He's on a mission, and he is increasingly, if you take theologians and commentaries dress up Luke's gospel, we break it up into chapters. The theologians often look at it and go, we can break it up into before chapter 9 and after chapter 9. Before chapter 9, we're getting to know Jesus. After chapter 9, Jesus is pretty much just on his way to the cross. Every time you read about him, everything that's happening with him, he's heading for the cross. He's always on his disciples, right? We're not stopping here, we're going there. We're not getting comfortable here. You don't need to keep that. He's on a mission. Some of the older translations, I think, translate this first verse as he set his face like a flint for Jerusalem. He hardened himself for the journey. I don't know if that means he looked down at his sandals and his dusty feet and said, right, we've got a long walk ahead. I think it probably meant a little bit of that. He looked at his disciples who were probably going to want to not go to Jerusalem, and he's like, right, I'm going to have to be tough on them. I'm going to have to psych myself up. He made himself hard for the journey to Jerusalem. It was his mission. From here on in, he knows nothing else. When Luke writes about him and this journey, he uses the language of the Exodus. It's the actual word that Luke uses part of the way through this story. The Exodus, where Moses comes in and leads the people out of Egypt into the promised land. There's this mass exodus. It's this mass journey. It's this focused mission. What is the Passover story? Don't even put your coats on. We're headed out of here. That is what Jesus' story is like. That is the guy we're catching up with in this story. He's on a mission to the point that where we find him in this text, he's got nowhere to rest his head, verse 58. He's got nothing. He's left everything. No house, no home, no stuff. He is just on the mission of God, reaching out to the world. He's a bit like, he reminded me a little bit when I thought about him in his situ, of like a mountaineer. Mountaineers, when they're trying to get to the top of some of these difficult mountains with some of these difficult passes, they look at their bags and they say, we can't take anything more than we absolutely need to get up here. Have to drop those sarnies, have to put that in, whatever it is. We go as light as we can if we're going to get to the top. Such is his focus. Jesus responds to the guy that says he's going to follow him anywhere. That's what he says. Caught up with it all, perhaps. Sees Jesus, hears about the miracles, hears him teaching, wrapped up in it, says, right, I'm going to follow you wherever you go. Jesus' response, I think, tells us two things. When he says, I don't even have anywhere to lay my head. That's what he says to him. I don't have anywhere to stop. You're going to follow me now? It means two things, I think. First thing, followers of Jesus, Christians, perhaps you, us, churchgoers, are on a great mission. Don't know if you think about it like that. Don't know if you think about your story of faith like that. We're on a great mission. And it changes how we look at our stuff. It reshapes and reforms how we look at our stuff. It costs us. I need to tell you that there are Christian believers across the world who have given everything up. There are Christian believers across the world who have said, hearing this story, seeing what Jesus did, and said, right, I'm going to have nothing, and I'm off. I'm all in. There are Christian believers in this world who look at all of the stuff that they have, and they say, I need to try and figure out how to use this for God's glory. It challenges the way we look at our stuff. Maybe if we flip it the other way around, it asks us to think about what we do with our human bodies. Think about Jesus. He has nothing on the one hand, and yet he is completely able to do the mission of God because he's dropped everything else. We have these amazing human bodies. We are able to do great acts of kindness. We're able to spend time talking to people and showing them that we love them. Human beings are incredible things. God made us to be incredible. We are at great liberty to do amazing, great good. Jesus released himself from all the trappings of the world, all of the stuff. I love stuff. I can't tell you how much I love getting new stuff. Sometimes loads of stuff just weighs you down, doesn't it? You got stuff, you just want to get the next bit of stuff. That's what happens, basically. Or you say, I want more of that or better versions of that. And we need some stuff. And at the same time, we can be incredibly swamped with stuff. Jesus liberates himself of all his stuff and he says, I'm on a mission. That's the first thing that I think we see. Challenges about where we're going. The second thing we see, I think this is a prompt. When Jesus says to this man, I've got nowhere to lie my head. Part of me thinks he's looking at the guy who's saying, I'm going to follow you anywhere, amazed by him, and saying to him, you need a jolt. You think this is going to be great? You think this is dead easy? Jesus says to him, in effect, I think, stop, mate. Just stop for a second. There's no way you're going to be able to keep this up. I think he says to him, in effect, you need to know that if you're following me, because of what is demanded, you're going to need grace. You're going to need to get down on your hands and knees, knowing how beautiful and brilliant this calling is, and you're going to need grace. You're going to need to know that you're not going to keep this up. He changes how we think, changes what we know, and he changes where we go. And you hear all that, and you say, I can't wait to go and get a Starbucks, because that's quite a heavy message, actually. Didn't come for that. I want to, it's nice. I can go along with it. It seems like it's what's happening, but I don't know if I'm ready to think on that level. I'm not sure this story is worth all that. The last two guys Jesus meets, I think he's telling us why this story is worth it. Verse 59 to 60, we just need to read that one. He says to another man, follow me. He says he's walking along on his way to the cross. But he replied, and this is the one that we get stuck on. This is kind of the text that grabs hold of you when you're reading through the Gospels because it sounds so harsh. First, let me go and bury my father. And Jesus says what sounds like the harshest words in the world. Jesus says to him, let the dead bury their own dead. You go and proclaim the kingdom of God. What is Jesus doing there? Is he just being harsh? Is he just being awkward? Does he mean that? Does death not matter? Does Jesus think nothing of death? Is he blinded by the focus that he's on? What is he saying? He's not saying that, I don't think. Read through the Gospels, read through Jesus. He's filled with compassion. There's two things that I think we see. The first thing is, it just doesn't fit with what Jesus says. It doesn't fit with what he teaches. He teaches strongly for his disciples to look after the elderly. We see in his own death how sacrosanct that moment is. I don't think it fits with Jesus' character. The second thing is I don't think that's what's happening here. This is the main point. I think Jesus spots something that we maybe miss a few thousand years later in the text. This might sound a bit controversial when I say it out loud. But all of the old scholars that I've read say the same thing. We don't actually think that this guy's dad is dead. When he says, let me go and bury my father, In ancient Near Eastern culture, if one of your relatives has passed away, certainly at this time, given the heat, given how they could look after a body, you buried them straight away. It was a quick burial. It was an instant burial. He wasn't around following Jesus if his dad had just died. What has happened is he's thought about the cost of following Jesus, and he's thought about his elderly relative, and he's thought, well, I kind of need to look after him. What Jesus does is spot an excuse. He's calling out an excuse. The guy that said, let me go and bury my family. He's looked at what it means to follow Jesus. He's interested, and he said, oh man, I'm going to wait till my dad's passed away, and I might get my inheritance. These two next guys are but guys, but first guys. That's what they are. Do you see it in the text? They've come along to Jesus, they're engaged with him, but their response to actually following him is, it's great, it looks amazing, but first I need to do this. But first I need to go and do that. That's what they are. They're but first guys. Do you know any but first guys? You might be a but first guy. You might be married to a but first guy. I am a but first guy, sometimes, depending on the context. I'll do it, but what does it mean when you say that? Do you know what it means for me? In certain contexts, if I meet somebody along the way and they ask me to do something, I'll do it, but do you know what it means? With me anyway, never going to happen. Oh, I'll get round to that. Dead on. Like, click my finger, wink at them, whatever you do. Yeah, I'll do that. I'm never going to happen. The least that it would mean is that I just don't care about it as much as you do. Whatever it is that you want me to do, it's just lower down on my list than it is with you. And Jesus is saying about the kingdom, Jesus is saying about the work that he's doing, this is not a but-if story. It's not a but-if story at all. This is the main story. This, Jesus is saying, is the most important thing that is going on, not just here, wherever we are, wherever they were. This is going on in the whole world, then and now. Jesus says to us, this matters. What I'm doing in this world, this matters more than anything else. It's maybe summed up really beautifully and quite subtly in the last little story that we read. Last guy says, I'll follow you, Lord, but first let me go back and say goodbye to my family. Jesus replied, no one who puts a hand to the plow and looks back is fit for service in the kingdom of God. He's referencing, I think, an Old Testament story about two of the great prophets, Elijah and Elisha. Elijah, God had said to him, you need to hand over the reins to the next great prophet, Elisha. And he comes to him and he puts his coat around him. And Elisha says, I can't just go right now. I need to go and speak to my family. And Elijah says, forget it. And he walks away. And Elisha realizes what he's done. He was out farming with his oxen and with his plow. And he realizes what he's done. And there and then, he slays the calves. And he uses the wood from the plow to burn up the calves. And he burns away his whole career. Burns away everything, and he follows him because he realizes what? What is Jesus saying? Not that family doesn't matter, not that it's not critically important. He screams that at us. Just that his work in your life is the most important thing. On your drive home tonight, or your walk home tonight, however you got here, you could have no better thought in your head than God is real. And he's bothered about humanity. He's bothered about me. And he can forgive me. And he can keep me. And I can know him. And the guy or girl that you work with on Monday morning could hear no better news, no more important information than God is real. And he cares about you. And he'll keep you. And he can change your life around. And he can save you. And in the end, his kingdom comes. And he's going to make everything new. There is no more important story you will hear, and it's definitely not because I'm saying it, it's because Jesus says it. There's no more important story than that you will hear today, tomorrow, or forever. And every now and again, we'll remember that. In short, I think what we're hearing is this calling that is ours to change our minds and to change our direction is well worth it.